This is the story of Owain Glyndwr, the last Prince of Wales, a hero to the Welsh, yet largely unknown beyond. Che Guevara was inspired by Owain Glyndwr, and it's claimed that Fidel Castro kept a book on Glyndwr on the shelves of his study. He was admired for his guerrilla tactics and tenacity in his fight against the English crown. Shakespeare features Owain in the play Henry IV, where Henry Bolingbroke, King Henry IV, refers to him as a magician able to summon up storms, mist and hail to harass his army as Henry attempted to retake Wales. Ultimately, England was victorious, and an independent and united Wales only lasted 15 years, with Owain neither captured nor slain in battle, but simply disappearing. Like King Arthur, he is prophesied to return when Wales needs him most. This mythical account of Owain Glyndwr is perhaps because there are scant records about him, and the fact that he's a Welsh rather than Scottish hero, and it leads to a lack of awareness of the struggle and the man. With the exception of an S4C bilingual film back in the 80s, there is little in the way of popular culture about him.
Remember, lads, the shield is also a weapon.
Despite the apparent failure of Glyndwr's uprising, there is a story, an adventure, a turning point in history, when England's very existence was in peril, and when another surprising hero changed history. Like all good action heroes, Owain Glyndwr has his origin story. He was born in the middle of the worst century for Europe, in 1354. The scene of death and destruction was set in 1315, when years of no summer, probably caused by atmospheric loading from a volcano in Iceland, and this caused crop failures and widespread famine and disease in the weakened population across Europe. In 1347, the Black Death arrived, killing a third of the population and half the population of towns and cities. Despite this death and destruction, European nobles were able to add more. War raged across Europe, most notably the 100-Year War between England and France. It was indeed a dangerous time to be alive, and a particularly easy time to be dead. So, how do we put this into context? Because this post-apocalyptic Europe is rarely touched upon. The First World War saw an unprecedented loss of life in Europe of mainly young men, which would go on to have significant cultural impacts in the following decades. But despite 20 million dying in Europe, both civilian and military, the death toll was less than 5%. In the Second World War, Britain, despite enduring 5 years of conflict, including the Blitz, had a combined death toll for civilian and military of just 1% of the population. The Soviet Union lost millions, but this amounted only to 13%. In the 14th century, cities losing half their population were devastated, and in England alone, there's over 3,000 lost villages that were simply abandoned. European population did not recover to the years of bounty prior to 1315 for 250 years. And the plague never went away. It killed 20% of Londoners in the 1360s, and another outbreak across the entire country in the 1370s. Violence was cultural. Nobles were motivated by a potent combination of ambition, economic necessity, feudal obligations, and values that glorified war. While the human cost was immense, the entrenched system of power and short-term incentives of warfare often outweigh concerns about the broader consequences, perpetuating cycles of destruction throughout the 14th century. A zombie apocalypse complete with bands of violent warlords. George R.R. Martin summed up the period poetically in Game of Thrones, with the army of the dead threatening the living, who were occupied with their own squabbles. The story of the Welsh Independence War has to be seen with the backdrop of a post-apocalyptic landscape that had gripped Europe for decades and had weakened the power of kings and nobles. Owain was of noble Welsh birth, with some privilege in English society. He spoke Welsh, English and French. As a young man, he trained as a lawyer and possibly working in London, witnessing the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This was led by Wat Tyler, where thousands of ordinary workers attacked the very heart of government, the Tower of London, and killed royal officials. This rebellion spread across England, but it was put down, leading to the deaths of some 1,500 rebels and their leaders. The Peasants' Revolt was a consequence of both the economic system of feudalism, where the wealthy exploited the workers, keeping them in poverty, and the plague, with a high death toll exacerbated by that poverty. By the age of 30, Owain was married and had inherited the family estates of Sycath and Glyndwr. He then served for the young King Richard II in the military for 4 years with engagements against the Scots, first as a squire to the future king Henry Bolingbroke, then honing his skills as a commander. As a 46-year-old with a reputation, 2 estates, and comfortable retirement from which to offer his generous hospitality, he could have been no more than a mention in medieval genealogy. Owain's rise as rebel leader is very much that of an unlikely hero. A backdrop to the reign of Richard II was one of threats of invasion by France, the king's own irrational behaviour, and plotting by nobility against him. King Richard retaliated by arresting lords and executing them for treason. England was in crisis. It's important to note that Richard was 10 years old when he became king. He was born in France and spoke French, and England's territories extended into France, at some points in time having more English territory in France than the King of France. He was 14 when confronted by Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt. And when Owain served in his army fighting the Scots, Richard was just 18. Richard, like his father Edward III, was a warlord. A feudal system where kings granted favours and land to lords who in return gave loyalty, taxes, and soldiers. And this form of governance evolved out of the collapse of the Roman Empire centuries before. Whereas the state was paramount in Roman times, the kings and lords were obsessed with dynasties and the survival of the family. Hence the obsession with queens handed over in marriages of alliance to have a son, so as to continue succession, and encouraged by the church, who saw their authority as supreme, and a consequence of their family line being traced back to the disciples. It was a literal Game of Thrones, as enemies and alliances were made as nobles sought to extract as much advantage as possible from the situation, whether it was lands, wealth, and influence.
Your Majesty.
A neighbour to Owain was the English Ranald Grey, 3rd Baron Grey of Ruthven, a lowly but ambitious border lord who had seized lands belonging to Owain. This property dispute went to the king, who ruled in favour of Owain, and there the matter should have been settled, except for the actions of the 32-year-old Henry Bolingbroke, cousin to King Richard, and childhood playmate. Henry's scheming against the king had led to his exile, but he returned in 1399, taking his forces to North Wales to meet King Richard, who had spent the summer of that year fighting in Ireland, with his royal guard and loyal nobles. Nothing like a foreign war to avoid dealing with the problems at home. Despite negotiations, Richard had lost his support in England, and he was arrested by Henry Bolingbroke at Flint Castle. They returned to London, where Richard was imprisoned in the Tower.
No, for I must no thing be, therefore no, for I resign to thee.
With the new king on the throne, Ranald contested the previous ruling that was in favour of Owain, and for good measure added that Owain had refused to raise forces for the ongoing war with the Scots, an act of treason no less. Ranald was ambitious and on the Privy Council to Henry, and he had influence. As a Marches Lord, He was also responsible for raising troops for the service of the king, and it was he who had in fact delivered the request to Owain for men far too late for Owain to respond. The king ruled that Renaud could take Owain's estates until Owain had a chance to prove his innocence. However, Renaud had poisoned the well, framing Owain as a rebel. For the 46-year-old Owain Glyndwr, this was the last straw, and with a small force wreaked havoc in Renaud's lands. Now, since the subjugation of the Welsh by Edward I, English lords had colonised Wales with English settlers, all behind walled towns, the most notable being Conwy and Carnarvon. Renaud's castle was in the walled town of Lytton, on the Welsh-English border. It's rather quaint now, and the castle is being rebuilt to be a Victorian castle hotel, and it's about 12 miles north of Owain Glyndwr's estate. At Cowen, Owain assembled his men and headed north to exact revenge. On the 9th of September, 1400, on Market Day, 250 Welshmen infiltrated the milling crowds of colonists, and when signalled, threw off their disguises, whipped out their weapons, and commenced slaying the crowds of English all about them, and the town was set ablaze. Owain and his forces then went on a rampage. In Anglesey, in Ysmon, the Tudor brothers, who were descendants of the Welsh princes and cousins to Owain, declared allegiance to the rebellion. King Henry's first summer as king was spent fighting the Scots. By the end of September, he had to reroute his forces to Shrewsbury, but instead of seeking Owain and his rebels, he instead headed to Anglesey to take on the Tudors and their considerable forces. Henry led his army around North Wales. He was harangued constantly by bad weather, with rain that lowered morale, rusted weapons, and caused the wagon train to sink in the mud, whilst being attacked by Welsh guerrillas. The English army was much motivated by looting as loyalty. But here in Wales, they found only deserted peasant villages. When Henry arrived on Anglesey, he harried the island, burning villages and monasteries, desecrated the graves of the Tudor family, but met no opposition until Rhys ap Tudor led an ambush of the king's forces at a place called the Great Moor. After they were engaged, the English fled back to the safety of Beaumaris Castle. 2 weeks later, Henry was back in Shrewsbury, before heading off to Worcester with little to show for his efforts. Winter forced a close to the fighting season, but the rebellion had roused a sleeping Welsh dragon. Welsh workers across England downed their tools and returned home to fight for independence. Owain had only set out for personal revenge. In the end, this property dispute erupted into a full-scale war. In the following year, the rebellion spread across North Wales, with ad hoc attacks on manors and castles as far south as Brecon. King Henry appointed Henry Hotspur Percy, the warrior son of the powerful Earl of Northumberland, to bring the country to order. Owain and the Tudor brothers, Rhys and Willem, were wanted men. Tudor brothers needed a bargaining chip, and they chose the duel in Edward I's Ring of Iron, Conwy Castle. Despite being impregnable, on April the 1st of 1401, they devised a cunning plan. The castle had been designed to be safely guarded with a minimum of manpower, just 60 archers and 15 knights. But on Good Friday, the bulk of the forces attended the church within the town. With just 40 men, Rhys and Willem infiltrated the town, and one made his way to the gate and feigned entry, claiming he was a carpenter on urgent business. He stabbed the guards, and with the small force gained entry, killing the 3 other guards on duty. The most powerful castle in Britain fell to a ruse. Henry Hotspur Percy arrived with 120 knights and 300 archers. But he knew that his forces were not enough to take the castle by force. They had brought a primitive cannon, but this was more for its shock value, to have a much bigger bark than bite. Instead, Hotspur chose negotiation, offering pardons to the rebels 3 weeks into the siege. King Henry overturned the deal. As a response to the rebellion and the lawlessness across Wales, Parliament went on to enact laws, most of which were vindictive, making the Welsh second-class citizens. Land ownership in England and the holding of any public office were forbidden. The consequence was to drive Welsh subjects into the arms of the rebellion. More laws were passed the following year, over a dozen in total, including the disenfranchising of Englishmen or women who married a Welsh man or woman. As Henry tightened his grip on the rebellion, so the Welsh slipped through his fingers. Not only had triggered a rebellion, but it was largely a general uprising with few collective objectives. He had a small army of a few hundred warriors, lightly armed and mobile on Welsh ponies. Now, they were camped on the hillside in late May, where an English expedition was dispatched from Pembrokeshire, and it was made up of around 1,500 English and Flemish colonists. They found Owain's camp, charged down onto them, and despite being outnumbered, Owain ran at his men, fought back, killing 200, and causing the rest to make a hasty retreat. Meanwhile, in Conwy, the Tudor brothers ended their occupation of the castle after Willem wrote to Henry, and it was the end of June that the rebels agreed to leave. But the unlucky defenders would have to face justice. A few of their number would be executed. It would not be until autumn that King Henry launched a major offensive against Wales. He set off from Hereford, and the English made their way to Strata Florida Abbey, the monastic order of Cistercians, who were known to be sympathetic to Owain. The English had to face both the weather and Welsh guerrilla attacks on the column. The English looted, raped and pillaged their way as they crossed Wales. At the abbey, Henry executed a monk for alleged bearing arms against him, sacked the monastery, destroying some of the buildings, raided the wine cellar, and returned home by the end of October, with nothing much accomplished. Emboldened, Owain mustered a larger force, enough to besiege the English colony and symbol of English dominance in Wales of Carnarvon Castle. The battle was probably more symbolic. Here, Owain flew his new banner, the dragon, reminiscent of Arthur Pendragon, and the son of destiny, Arthur. A prophecy that was exploited by the English was of a Welsh woman who married the Roman Emperor Constantine III, whose offspring would save the Britons. It was this prophecy that led Edward to build Carnarvon Castle in the style of the Roman architecture of the walls of Constantinople. And he wanted to have his son born there and proclaimed Prince of Wales. The symbolism was clear. He would be a Welshman, born of a Welsh woman and Emperor Constantine's line, that would save the Britons. As for Henry Hotspur Percy, given the role of defeating the rebellion, he complained to King Henry that he was not getting enough forces or support to pursue the subjugation of the Welsh, and that anti-Welsh laws were actually driving support for rebellion. Well, still, there was concern that the unrest may spread to England, where opposition to King Henry festered with widespread belief that Richard was still alive. Now, Henry Hotspur favoured negotiation, and it's rumoured that he was already in secret negotiations with Owain. In the winter of 1402, Owain launched an attack on his old enemy, Reynold, at Ruthven, ambushing and capturing him, and he took him to the Snowdonian mountain stronghold castle of Dolbaden. War for both rebel and king was expensive, and compared to the great battles of previous eras, the armies were small and the conflict local. Now, Owain could divide tax destined to the king, and his troops could survive on some looting, but the wealth of Wales was largely in English colony towns and manors, and ransom was an effective means of funding the rebellion. Reynold had a ransom of 10,000 marks. Now, a mark is not a currency. Pounds, shilling and pence were currency at the time. A mark was value, so 10,000 marks could pay the wages and equipment for 1,000 bowmen or 250 knights for a year. Not quite a king's ransom, but the value of a large estate. And to put it into perspective, it was about a fifth of the tax the king raised from all of Wales. The king paid the ransom in summer, with Reynold expected to make good for the loan. Now, King Henry wasn't faring any better. Welsh tax revenue was diminishing, and he was reliant on feudalism, where lords raised and funded their own armies to serve the king's wishes in return for approval and retaining the Welsh lands and occasionally their lives. It would not be until June of 1402 that another expedition was assembled by Sir Edmund Mortimer, cousin to King Henry, and he was based in Ludlow. He ventured into mid-Wales to confront Owain's forces on this hillside near Prestine, on the Welsh border, with around 2,000 knights and archers. On the hill above them was 1,500 Welsh. Owain had split his forces. He'd kept his archers at the top of the hill, and his mobile mounted troops were concealed in the flanking woods. Sir Edmund, believing he had superior forces, mounted a direct frontal attack up the hill, and despite having his own archers, they were outranged by the Welsh with the higher ground. When the knights reached Owain's main, the concealed forces attacked from the rear, and at some point the Welsh archers in the employ of Edmund defected and fired on the knights. It was a bloodbath. Edmund was captured, and at least half his army was slaughtered, along with 3 prominent generals. Welsh women camp followers were said to have descended on the bloody battlefield, looting the corpses, killing the wounded, and cutting off the cocks as revenge for King Henry's incursion the previous year. The smell of death lingered apparently for months. Owain ransomed Sir Edmund. This time King Henry refused, as it was far better for him to have Edmund, who had a greater claim to the throne, out of the way. In a twist, the 26-year-old Edmund negotiated an alliance with Owain and married his eldest daughter, Katrine, resulting in 3 daughters. By the winter, Edmund had proclaimed his full support for Owain and to endeavour to return King Richard to the throne if alive, or his cousin, confusingly also called Edmund Mortimer, the 5th Earl of March. The Welsh War of Independence was similar to other wars of the period, such as the 100-Year War between England and France, the 32-year War of the War of the Roses, and the 32-year War of Scottish Independence. The actual amount of fighting was limited to a few key battles, and sieges where months if not years would pass, with little happening in between. In the case of the Welsh Rebellion, King Henry simply could not muster an army large enough, like Rome had 1,000 years earlier, to have a war of occupation. It was just too expensive, and the manpower were not at his disposal. Owain's rebellion was one of insurgency, attacking when able to muster a large enough force against injured colony towns or manors. His men still had to tend their businesses to survive. His other problem was to rein in and coordinate ad hoc attacks by non-aligned Welshmen. King Henry likewise offloaded the problem onto individual lords, who had to look at their own resources to defend their castles, manors and colonies. Henry also had his own problems, a rebellion in England, with lords still loyal to King Edward. By the 3rd year, the rebellion had spread across the nation, and Owain had marched south following the Towy Valley, with English manors and castles surrendering as he advanced, with village after village joining the rebellion. Carmarthen Castle fell, and turning east, his forces took on Abergavenny, Cardiff, Usk, and the Newport castles. In the north, Carmarthen Castle was besieged, and this time with French forces in the south, with the aid of Breton pirates. The Welsh attacked and laid siege to Kidwelly walled town and castle. King Henry replaced Henry Hotspur Percy with his son Henry Monmouth, the future Henry V, the 17-year-old prince called Hal in Shakespeare's plays. A supposed reluctant king who preferred the company of drunkards, but this playboy ultimately saved England, transforming the country, but more on his legacy later. Hal's initial response was to lead his army to the former estates of Owain, that had been awarded to John Beaufort, half-brother to the King Henry. John evidently had not taken over the estates, as Hal looted the properties and burned down the manors and defensive towers. In July, in Chester, Henry Hotspur declared against the king, along with his uncle Thomas Percy, Earl of Worcester, and father Henry Percy. Hal was forced to turn his army around and had to confront him, with both armies meeting outside Shrewsbury. Now, King Henry was unaware of the rebellion in the first week, as he was on his way to fight against the Scots. On hearing that there was a rebellion, he turned around, headed south to Shrewsbury to join his son. The strength of both sides was around 14,000 men each. The battle was epic. The king's forces, although possibly larger in number, took heavy casualties, and Hal was shot in the face with an arrow. His survival was only due to the skills of the royal physician. Henry Hotspur Percy, charging directly at the king, was brought down by an arrow, and in the confusion the cries that Henry had fallen, no one was actually sure which Henry it was. King Henry had come close to death and defeat, but was able to claim victory despite the heavy losses. His capture of Thomas Percy and 2 other rebel leaders added to the victory, and they were hung, drawn, and quartered in Shrewsbury. But King Henry's forces were severely weakened. Hundreds of his knights have died in the battle, and thousands of soldiers were either dead or injured, with the rebels still at large and the country near bankrupt. there was no chance of continuing the fight against Owain Glyndwr. By the summer of 1404, Owain had captured and garrisoned the great castles of Aberystwyth and Harlech and set about governing a near-independent Wales. At Machynlleth, where the original hall still stands, he was crowned Prince of Wales and the Welsh Parliament sat. English presence was reduced to a few castles, walled towns and fortified manor houses. Owain set about making alliances with Henry's enemies, the Scots, Bretons, French and English rebels, which included his now son-in-law, Edmund Mortimer, and Henry Percy, who had survived the Battle of Shrewsbury. In 1405, the tripartite indenture was agreed. Owain would take Wales as an independent kingdom, with its borders extending as far as Worcester. Percy would have the north of England, extending south to the Midlands and incorporating Norfolk, with Edmund Mortimer and his claim to the English crown taking southern England. England was on a precipice. But Wales was struggling too. Welsh forces of some 8,000, led by Rhys Gethin, attacked Rosemont Castle and the walled town of Abergavenny. At the time, it was the third largest town in South Wales, and the town was destroyed. The castle held out long enough for Hal to dispatch John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, who reinforced it with his own knights to ambush the Welsh. The English were successful, not only killing anywhere up to 1,000 Welsh, but also capturing Gruffydd ab Owain Glyndwr, the eldest son of Owain. Gruffydd was imprisoned in the Tower of London and remained there until his death of bubonic plague 7 years later. Later, the Welsh attacked Usk town and the castle. On this occasion, the English garrison were able to rout the Welsh forces, pursued them into the forest, where many were killed. It seems the changing nature of battle from guerrilla insurgency to full face-to-face battle did not favour the Welsh. For one, they didn't have the siege weapons, nor the heavy knights required in more traditional warfare. Both battles had also been costly in terms of experienced fighters, with the Welsh losing some 2,000 of their best men. In the summer, 5,000 French troops arrived at Milford Haven, and with Owain's army marched into England for a showdown with Henry's forces in Worcestershire. The English occupied the Iron Age hill fort of Aberley Hill, with Glyndwr's forces on another Iron Age hill fort of Woodbury Hill, and nothing happened. For 8 days, the two sides, separated by a mile of potential battlefield, remained in their defensive positions. Owain, the talented guerrilla leader, refused to make a head-on attack on the English, and likewise Henry waited. With supplies running out, Glyndwr retreated to Wales, and the French troops returned home. Henry tried to push his advantage, sending forces to release besieged castles like Bridgend, but often the Welsh were able to ambush the English on their home turf. Now Hal, in contrast to his father, adopted a very different strategy, having economic blockades rather than these punitive expeditions. Now this was in part out of necessity. He simply lacked money and the resources. He used the remaining castles that were in English hands and the Marches lords to cut off supplies, weapons, and to cripple trade with Wales. By 1407, the tactic was paying off, as people chose survival over loyalty to an independent Wales. In Flintshire, Welshmen publicly declared their abandonment of the struggle. Lordships once loyal to Glyndwr, particularly along the marches, such as Clun and Oswestry, pledged their allegiance to the king. In 1408, Hal turned his attention to the seat of power, besieging Aberystwyth Castle and taking it in the autumn. The following year, he blockaded Harlech Castle. Edmund Mortimer was to die in that battle, and wife and children were taken by the English and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Owain remained at large, his forces remaining a guerrilla army. In 1410, he, along with other loyal commanders, mounted a raid deep into Shropshire. Its purpose remains a mystery. but it was a disaster with commanders captured, including one of the Tudor brothers, and all were hung, drawn and beheaded. Over the following 5 years, Owain was still active, and England failed to gain complete control of Wales, but the rebellion had turned into banditry with kidnappings to raise funds through ransom. King Henry died in 1413, with Hal taking the throne as Henry V. He offered pardons to the remaining rebels and even to Owain himself. In 1415, the rebellion was over, and Wales was in ruins. Prosperous towns lay empty, the population impoverished, and Owain vanished into the mountains. The 28-year-old Henry V, learning from his experience as a warrior prince, turns England's fortunes around. In 1415, he was embarking on an invasion of France, but rather than rely on the feudal system of lords bringing their own retinue of knights and foot soldiers, he hired his army. In particular, Welsh bowmen, who flocked to his side with a promise of basic pay and booty. This led in part to Henry's success at Agincourt. It was not just his reliance on archers, who made up 5 in every 6 men, but unlike the French, he had a far greater control over the deployment of his troops. The French, with their feudal system, had multiple lords having control of their individual retinue, and all competing for glory on the battlefield. This success in France and new territories led to wealth for England. His father had nearly seen England perish, but Hal's reign brought unity. Old differences were forgotten. Rebel English lords forgiven. Even the late Richard II's body was given an honourable burial, and English was promoted as a language of government. As for Owain, no one knows his fate, but the Welsh language continued, as does the rebellious resilience of Wales. But there is one last twist. A son of one of the Tudor brothers who fought alongside Owain Tudor, born when the uprising started. After moved to England and became a courtier to Henry V. Some say he fought at Agincourt as a page to Henry. Following King Henry's premature death in 1422, the widowed Queen of England, Catherine, married Owain, and the two had 3 children, half-brothers to Henry VI, and it would be Edmund Tudor who would father Henry Tudor, born in Pembroke Castle in 1457, Henry VII, King of England. His son Henry VIII, unifying England and Wales. Owain's legacy is alive in Wales today. There is a growing independence movement, although not as strong as Scotland's. Owain, as a Welsh prince, had quite a different outlook to nobility to that of the English nobles, obsessed with dynasties. Wales never had a single king. There were, of course, noble families that could trace their roots back to pre-Roman times, but they held up the land as the foundation of the basis of sovereignty. Noble families were equals, and leaders would emerge. Wales, or rather Cymru, is the land of fellows, the Cymry. Owain sought to update the traditions of Wales with European forms of governance and forging alliances with Europe. Likewise, the independence movement of Wales, of Cymru, sees itself as part of a larger pan-European movement rather than an insular nationalistic one. I do hope you found this video interesting. Do subscribe, like and comment.